Hello, everyone. All right. Welcome to the App Runtime Interfaces Extravaganza. I'm Greg, and I'll be your tour guide today. So first, I'm going to do a brief overview of the agenda, and then we'll get into it. So we'll start with a little bit about me, in case you don't know who I am. Then we'll talk about App Runtime Interfaces. Then we'll do a brief overview of some of the new members who have joined us this year. We'll go over some of the features that we've developed, and then we'll take a little tiny peek at some of the stuff that may be coming up in the future. And then we'll wrap everything up, and then I'll get out of your way. So first, who am I? So I'm at Gerg on both GitHub and Slack. So if you've ever had a discussion with one of these avatars, that was me. I'm currently a tech lead at VMware, and I'm also the execution and technical lead for Application Runtime Interfaces Working Group for the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Just for fun, I decided to go back and look and see what my first contribution that I could find to Cloud Foundry was. So my first interaction with Cloud Foundry was working on some data services that are long gone, but my first core contribution to Cloud Controller was this commit. So if anyone runs into any issues with how centralized the service instance delete logic is in Cloud Controller, you know whose fault it is. It's Sabeti's. So anyway, I have a bit of Cappy bias. I just want to put this up front. As you may have noticed by the capybara pictures that are going to show up, the majority of the time I spent working on Cloud Foundry was on Cappy or Cappy-related projects, so just know that going into it. But I'll try to be as objective as possible when talking about other things that have been going on. So let's talk a little bit about ARI. So as most of you probably know, Cloud Foundry Foundation moved to a new governance model in the last year. And as part of that, we've created this Cloud Foundry community repo, which lays out all of the details of how the new governance model works. If you ever want to read a bunch of markdown files that exhaustively describe all the different phases of it, this is going to be a great repository for you if you haven't already seen it. And in that repository, there is a charter for the App Runtime Interfaces working group. And in there, it has a mission statement. And our mission statement is to provide APIs for the CF App Runtime and community clients for end users. So how I read that is the really core important part of App Runtime Interfaces is the interfaces portion of it. So if we look at a really low resolution view of what Cloud Foundry is, there's an app developer who wants to see CF push their app. They work through the App Runtime Interfaces working group, which handles a lot of the touch points where they actually interact with Cloud Foundry. And potentially multiple projects there, potentially multiple that are layered on top of each other. And then that kind of reaches back to the App Runtime Platform working group, which I consider our sister working group. And they're responsible for handling a lot of the kind of inner workings of actually running that application or whatever else you may be doing on Cloud Foundry. Within our working group, we have 8 different areas, or you can kind of think of them as teams. We have Autoscaler, Buildpacks, Cappy, CLI, Docs, Java tools, multi-apps, and notifications. So this is just kind of a representation of all the various things that are going on in our working group. And if you ever want to see details of what repositories these different areas are responsible for or who's on those, you can go back to that Cloud Foundry community repo I was talking about and look at that same charter. And in there, there'll be a beautiful YAML file or YAML block that goes into exhaustive detail on all of the contributors and all of the different repos that they're responsible for. And if you want to come chat with us, we're on Cloud Foundry Slack in the Slack channel. Always happy to discuss any of the projects that we work on there. So let's do a really brief overview of some of the new approvers who joined the working group this year. So since it's all new, in a sense, everyone's a new approver, but I kind of picked an arbitrary point where we had established the original starting set of approvers and then looked at all of the people who are new since then. So both Autoscaler and Buildpacks got 1 new approver over the last year. The Cappy area has 4 new approvers. And then CLI and Docs both also have 1 new approver. So welcome to everyone who was there. We couldn't do this without approvers. I'll also do a brief overview of some of the new reviewers in the area. So for those of you who aren't familiar, reviewer is a new role that was very recently added to CFF. As described in the roles markdown file, a reviewer is an active contributor who wishes to formally work towards the approver role. So this is a great opportunity for people who want to get involved with different CFF projects, but don't quite meet the criteria for approver yet. So new reviewers for our working group. We have 3 new reviewers on CAPI, and then CLI has 5 new reviewers. So there's plenty of other teams that don't currently have reviewers. So if you're interested in starting the process of contributing to any of these areas, I definitely recommend that you apply for reviewer status. It's definitely a great way to get involved, and there's plenty of PRs that need reviewing. So yeah, if you want to be a new member in our working group, there's this roles markdown file that goes into a lot of detail on what the process and requirements for the new different roles are. And if you open a PR for one of the RE areas, then I will be responsible for reviewing that and going through that process, and always happy to have new members. All right. So let's get into some of the new stuff that we've been working on over the last year or so. This is mostly new features, but there's also a few other topics in here that we're going to cover related to deprecations or stuff like that. So here's the whole list of topics I'm going to cover. This is not an exhaustive list of all the stuff that our teams have been working on. So definitely there'll be some subject matter experts for each of those topics that you may want to follow up on, but go ahead and pick out what your favorite topic is, because it'll be coming up soon. All right, so let's start with the V3 API. So at this point, the V3 API is good to go. If you're not already using it, you should be thinking about moving to it or actively moving towards it. New CAPI features, by default, are only going to come to the V3 API. And at this point, we've already moved over several high-use clients, and they've been able to move over successfully. So we believe that you should also be able to at this point. That's not to say there might be, a few small issues remaining. So definitely, if you run into something, come chat in Slack or open a GitHub issue, and we'd be happy to help smooth over the process for you. There is an upgrade guide for it on the V3 API docs at that URL. So definitely check that out if you're going through the upgrade process. And if you notice there's anything missing from that, always happy to update that to help make the path smoother for other people who are making that transition. So then that raises the question, well, what about the V2 API? What's going on with that thing? I think this is the #1 question I get, both internally at VMware and from the community. So I'm going to continue to talk about that, and hopefully this will help answer some of your questions there. So at this point, the V2 API is fully deprecated. It will not get any new features or improvements. So it will you should not be expecting that any of the exciting things that we're talking about here or we'll be talking about in the future will be represented on that API. However, it also is not going to go away currently. So we found that there's a large number of clients out there that people still actively use that aren't actively maintained. And so the effort to move all of those clients over and the pain that would be caused by ripping away people who are depending on those clients was too high for us to be able to undertake that project. However, for a individual Cloud Foundry deployment, the operator can turn off the V2 API. So if you're an operator and you're having problems with the V2 API and you're fairly confident that none of your users actually want to use the V2 API or need to use the V2 API, then there is a manifest property that you can use to disable the V2 API. And I'm considering for right now the authoritative source and discussion point for V2 API related topics is Cloud Controller discussion number 2725, where I basically lay out a lot of this stuff. So if you have any further questions or follow-ups, I definitely say go check out that discussion thread, and that will kind of be the centralized place for talking about the future of V2 there. Also, CAPI performance improvements. So this is a really exciting topic. and I'm not going to talk about it because there's another talk about it coming up later today. So tune in then for a lot more detail than I could possibly cover in this talk, and that'll go into a lot of interesting topics there. I will, however, talk about a tiny slice of that, which is Puma. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Puma at this point is kind of the authoritative Ruby web server. I mentioned this, but Bosch moved to Puma several years ago and saw big improvements there. And then it's become the default Rails web server. So for a long time, Cloud Controller has been chilling on Event Machine and Thin, which made a lot of sense at the time, especially when Cloud Controller needed to talk with NATs. But I think we've now reached the point where that doesn't make sense anymore, and it's time to move on to Puma and hopefully see a lot of improvements based on that. Hopefully when we get Puma fully up and running, we'll see a lot better performance. We'll scale a lot better with modern hardware, especially with multi-core CPUs. And we'll also see more resilience. We have seen some cases where Event Machine can choke, especially if there's like dropped outbound IO operations and stuff like that. So hopefully switching over to Puma will help with that process. We're also, as part of this effort, moving off of StatsD and making it so Cloud Controller's component metrics are exposed with Prometheus. This is part of a larger change to move all of the components over to Prometheus. And as part of this, CAPI's component metrics will change. Right now, as much as the component metrics were designed, they are designed for running an Event Machine and Thin server and not well optimized for how Puma works. So there will be a new round of metrics there to better support operating Cloud Controller as a Puma server. So this is available right now in CAPI release. It's definitely in early stages. So I'd encourage you to try it out. Probably don't try it out in production unless you're feeling very exciting. All right, speaking of new things, let's talk about the V8 CLI. So the V8 CF CLI is a relatively minor upgrade over V7. Kind of the main feature of it is adding support for end-to-end HTTP2 routing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It also now uses V3 APIs for services commands, services-related commands. So at this point, we are now fully on the V3 API with the major caveat of plugins, which we'll also talk about in a little bit. So let's talk then about the V6 CLI. So the V6 CLI is no longer supported. So if you're currently using it, you should stop using it and migrate to V7 as soon as you can. There is a very exhaustive V7 upgrade guide. The V6 to V7 upgrade there are a large number of changes that had built up since we were on V6 for a long time. But the upgrade guide goes into a lot of detail talking about what changes you'll need to make to move to V7. So URL's at the bottom of the page. You should check that out. And as usual, if you run into any issues, definitely reach out on Slack, either in our working group channel or directly to me. Also, speaking of the CLI, we now this year released Mac ARM compatible or Apple ARM compatible versions of the CLI. So if you're like me and you're running on Apple Silicon, then you can install v8.4 and above or 7.5 and above, and it should run natively on your machine. And those are available on Brew. You can continue to use Rosetta 2 if you are on an older version, but I would definitely recommend moving to the native versions if at all possible. All right, let's talk a little bit about HTTP2 routing. So a lot of the core of HTTP2 routing happened in App Runtime Platform, but I did work on it, and it does get exposed a little bit in RE. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. So yeah, so this was a collaboration between RE and ARP. And so this is a good example of how different working groups can work together to deliver end-to-end features. So on the API, you can now specify a app protocol in your route destinations, and this will mean that HTTP2 traffic is forwarded all the way through to your application. So if you do have a use case where you need HTTP2 traffic all the way from ingress to your application, for example, if you're doing gRPC routing, then you'll need to enable that. And then similarly, you can use the CLI when you're mapping the route to specify that you want HTTP2. There's also a new CF route command that we introduced in V8, which you can use to inspect the route and its destinations, including what protocol it's routing to your app with. So definitely check that out if you're interested in any of those features. We also introduced the space supporter role, which is the first new role in Cloud Foundry for quite a while. So space supporter role, this is an example of a V3 only feature. So the space supporter role will not be respected on V2. So if you are assigned that role, you will not get any permissions to any of the V2 endpoints. It intentionally has less permissions than space developer, so it's kind of falling into that app operator persona. So someone who's responsible for keeping apps running and troubleshooting them if things are going wrong, maybe in a production-like environment. But they can't view things like secrets, and they can't push new source code to your applications. There's also some app autoscaler improvements, but once again, I'm not going to tell you anything about them because immediately after my talk, there will be another talk that goes into a lot more detail there. So definitely stay in your seats because there's going to be another talk about that shortly. All right. CF Linux FS4, unfortunately there was not a jellyfish emoji, so I had to go with the octopus, but I hope you'll understand. So the CF Linux FS4 stack, this is the new root FS for application containers. It's based on Ubuntu 2204 Jammy Jellyfish. Don't confuse this with the stem cell. The stem cell is the operating system that the Cloud Foundry components themselves run on. This is the root FS that the applications themselves run on. So CF Linux FS4 is now available, and we do have partial Buildpack support. As of when I made these slides, we had .NET, Java, Node.js, Python, and Golang, though it's possible there may be some more either in flight right now or releasing soon. CF Linux FS4 will be coming to CF deployment soon. There's an open issue for it. And it's worth noting that Bionic leaves standard support in April. So it's important if you're on standard support to start thinking about how you're going to move applications off of Bionic and onto the new stack. All right, Java Buildpack deprecations. So Dan had messaged this in CF Dev and also on GitHub and numerous other channels. But the Java Buildpack is deprecating Spring Auto Reconfig and Cloud Connectors. At this point, you should already be seeing warnings if you're on modern Buildpacks. But by the end of the year, Java Buildpack versions will no longer support this. So definitely, if you have applications that depend on this, check for those warnings, and you may need to do some work on the application side to continue to have those applications work in the new year. All right, and then finally, we'll talk about a new feature that came out, moving routes. This is hot off the presses. So the workflow here is you have an app that's in space 1. Through organizational restructures or whatever, you now want to move that app over to a different space, but you also don't want to have any downtime. Currently, that's not really possible because, or at least possible within Cloud Foundry, because the route is tied to the space that it's in. But with some of this new technology, we now have a workflow that will help you do that move without any downtime. So our objective is to move the app from space 1 to space 2, no downtime. So the first thing we do is we push a copy of that app into space 2. We then use CF share route to share that route over to space 2. So now the route is available in both spaces. We then use the CF move route command to make it so that the route is now based out of space 2 and shared into space 1 instead of vice versa. We then map the route to the copy of the app that's in space 2. So at this point, that route will balance traffic across both instances of the app. Then we'll unmap it from the app in the old space, and then we can use CF unshare route to complete our move of the route over to space 2. Though it's worth noting this unshare route command isn't released yet. It's been merged in, I believe, at this point, but hasn't been released in a CLI version, but should come in the next one. All right, so that was our brief overview of some of the features we've been working on. Now I'll give a little bit of a sneak peek into some of the things we could be working on in the future. I will give a big old disclaimer here that all of these are future things that we're currently thinking about, but could change at any time without notice. So I copied a whole bunch of random legalese in there. There isn't actually anything useful in there, so don't try to read it. It's just going to hurt you. But just keep in mind, these are some things we could be working on. So if you're interested in these, then you should come talk with me and maybe help out some so that they actually happen. So first thing is cloud native Buildpacks support for Cloud Foundry. So I know we've talked about this before, but we're trying it again. So this is a new effort that we're kind of in the early stages of thinking about. The plan as it is right now is to take the current Cloud Foundry Buildpacks interface and wrap it around some cloud native Buildpacks. Our current thinking is that it won't be backwards compatible for applications, and it, at least for now, won't replace existing Buildpacks. So something we're in the process of thinking about, and we'll hopefully have more to announce soon. Also, V3 CLI plugins. So as I mentioned a while ago, the V8 CLI is fully V3 except for the plugin interface. So there's currently a proposal open for a fully V3 plugin interface, which would mean then we would have a actually fully V3 CLI, and we could also remove a ton of legacy code from the CLI that's kind of been weighing it down for a while. So if this is something that sounds interesting to you, or you have any ideas or would like to contribute, there's currently a PR open against Cloud Foundry /CLI with a ton more discussion and details around that. So definitely check that out. I also have a couple of like super early stage proposals. These are ones that like probably won't happen in the near term unless there's people who are interested in starting to work on them. So definitely if any of these pique your interest, then come chat with me. But some of the early things that we've been thinking about are declarative app manifests. So especially in the modern era, you know, people think of manifests in Bosh or in Kubernetes as being declarative, but Cloud Foundry's app manifests are not fully declarative, and that can be surprising, especially to people who are moving on to Cloud Foundry from other platforms. So thinking about what would it look like to have a new version of app manifests that maybe restructure themselves some, take into account some of our newer features, and also are declaratively applied. And then also thinking about blue-green deployment strategies. So several years ago, we implemented rolling deploys, but a lot of people still use external blue-green deploy tooling, you know, because they want the new version of their app to be running concurrently with the old version of their app, do some validation before they tear it down. So it'd be interesting to think about how we might support that use case natively on Cloud Foundry so they don't have to continue using these external tools. All right, so wrapping things up. Like I mentioned, come chat with us on Slack about any of these topics or anything else related to our working group. You can also reach out to me at Gerg on Slack. And then for more details about how to join or any other of the details about how CFF works, check out the Cloud Foundry community repo. Thanks everyone for attending and for helping learn about ARI. Does anyone have any questions? All right, it sounds like there's some virtual questions.
All right. Hello? Cool. Peter Brookholder asks, for CI/CD service accounts, is there going to be a space deployer account?
So there's not currently any plans for additional roles. That said, we do now have modern precedent for adding new roles based on different use cases. So I think that's definitely something we could consider. As always, open an issue against Cloud Controller, and we can start a discussion. If there's multiple parties who are interested in a role like that, then I think that is definitely a feasible idea.
Great, thanks. And then Ben Gandon asks, question, with CF API v3 being complete, could we have the Perm project restarted? It was blocked waiting for v3 to be mainstream. That's an addict repository called Perm, and it was the solution to tailoring fine-grained roles so that CF can better adapt to the way large companies are organized.
Yeah, so that's, I think, in a lot of ways related to the previous question. So for those of you who weren't familiar with it, Perm would be a way to create custom user roles on Cloud Foundry. So if you did have a bespoke need for a user role with certain permissions, you wouldn't have to kind of cram them into one of the existing Cloud Foundry roles. So I'd say right now there aren't currently any plans for a Perm project, and I'm not even sure if a Perm project started, if it would fall under our working group. I don't know, that's maybe an interesting broader question. But I think at the time, the continued existence of the V2 API, I think, was the larger blocker than the V3 API not existing. And since we're continuing to plan to support V2, then I think in some regards that still remains a threat, though since the new space supporter role is only available on V3, maybe we now have precedent for that. So I don't know. If there was enough interested parties to form a team to work on that, then I think that would definitely be a good enhancement and would help solve a lot of user problems we have right now, but there's not currently any plans.
Great, thanks.
All right, any other questions?
Where can I find more information about the cloud-native Buildpacks idea?
Yeah, so right now that's super early stages. Our hope is that we'll have some sort of more concrete proposal out sometime, hopefully soon. But I think for right now, it's more of a interest in supporting it rather than a fully baked out plan, but we are in the process of trying to come up with something.
Anyone else?
All right, thank you everyone.